Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of Tech Backstage. I am joined today by Simon Maple, the Field CTO at Sneak. Simon, how you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show, and also I'm really excited that you're on the other side of the pond, so to speak, in England, and your internet connection seems to be pretty good. So I'm really excited about that too.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's a nice little setup that we got here. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's good. So before we jump into the topic, I'm going to be talking a lot about secure development practices
hmm
today, but would love to just kind of dive in briefly, talk a little bit about who you are, your background story, how you ended up becoming a field CTO at Sneak.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think my background is very I guess it was very predictable in the sense of how I got into technology. I kind of like went through university doing computer science, and as soon as I graduated, I moved to I got a job at a big enterprise company, IBM. And I just started doing software development there, really. So I've been a developer, 20 plus years commercially, and a good number of years before that as well at university and in my spare time. So yeah, I was a Java developer. I'm a Java champion as well, and yeah, I did a lot of middleware development. Stayed at IBM for around 12 years, and it got to that stage where I kind of like really yearned for that kind of startup experience, something which was kind of much smaller, much faster paced, more exciting. So I over the last 10 years or so, I've worked for a couple of startups, Zero Turnaround. I moved into DevRel, developer relations and advocacy, and I led the team there at Zero Turnaround for around 6 years. And Zero Turnaround, a company that's very much focused on developer tooling and productivity tooling around the Java space. So it's a really interesting space that meant a lot to me as a Java developer for many years, and it was a place that was very deep into Java bytecode. So it was very easy to geek out on that kind of thing. And then I moved across to Sneak, which was another very interesting challenge because it was security, it was developer security, so right in my kind of like ballpark with the developer advocacy. And I joined and I led the DevRel team initially, the developer relations and the community group, for a few years. And the opportunity came up to be a field CTO, which kind of sounded very exciting and very important. And I'm very happy to say I'm very excited in this role. And it's not as important as I first thought, but it's still very fun.
Talk to us a little bit about what a field CTO does. I imagine it still has a lot to do with technology, but for anybody listening in who might be interested in career paths, what the difference between a field CTO and maybe just a traditional CTO role would be.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's I must be a glutton for punishment in terms of starting roles just as they're being created. Because I think I joined when I was at IBM, I was just turning into a dev role in the very early days of developer relations becoming a thing, maybe 12 plus years ago. And I think field CTOs, it's been a role that's kind of been it's fairly new and still being established. And I think if you go from company to company, it actually looks quite different depending on the type of company as well. But certainly at Sneak, a field CTO is or my role as a field CTO. I certainly look into the market and I'm trying to identify market challenges, market changes that are happening, and trying to pull insights back into the company, and also sharing those insights with many of our customers and prospects. Because the field part of that is equally working with some of our biggest customers, and working with our biggest deals and prospects as well. So doing a lot of knowledge sharing across them around not just our vision direction as a company, but also our view on the market, how the
Mhm.
market's evolving, how the market's changing, and doing a lot of research around that and sharing that knowledge across organizations. So I'd say, the CTO piece is very much more business oriented, versus my side, which is a little bit more field oriented. But we still work very closely. I report into the CTO, and we work very closely with the labs team and the product teams as well.
That's very cool. Yeah, and I think everything you're just talking about right now, that just means you're on the cutting edge, man. It just means you're like right there, right?
It's fun actually. It
Yeah.
is really interesting to kind of like hear some of the research that's happening from inside of Sneak, as well as the research that's happening from individuals working at Sneak around the market. And so it's like it's great to kind of like hear all this very interesting new cutting edge stuff as well, for sure.
Yeah, and I love the idea too because, if you think back to like the old days, when Microsoft was releasing like one version of Windows or like, one version of Microsoft Word once a year, we were talking about these really like slow release cycles. There wasn't a lot of customer feedback, and that's very much not the norm nowadays. Nowadays,
Mm,
it's really about, getting customer insight, getting customer feedback, iterating on that feedback quickly, and getting, new changes into production for your customers to iterate on. And so what you're saying about being a field CTO makes a lot of sense, right? Because no matter what we do inside of a company, no matter how much we, wireframe out a user journey, or talk about what we think the business requirements are for a specific feature, I think we all know that as soon as it gets out into the wild, users are going to interpret how to use that specific feature that we spent months or even years toiling over, and then they're going to be like, no, I don't like it, the button should be over here on the left, and you're like, oh, we should have seen that, right? So I love the idea of somebody who has a technical background actually being out there in the field, trying to get that feedback from people who are going to end up being the end users of this product, and using that to interface with the internal team. I think that's a really cool twist on a traditional CTO role, and I think it helps drive products forward, right? I think that's really
mm,
cool. So,
mm.
great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for that quick rundown about the role.
Yeah, worries.
So let's dive in a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about Sneak for a second, and start talking about embracing secure development, right? Because I don't
Hmm.
think this is something that, just like we were talking about with the field CTO role, I think this is kind of a new or newer kind of practice, right? Like, I
Mm,
think we were talking about this backstage. Traditionally, security was really more of like a SecOps role, or like an enterprise security engineer role. And
mm.
now, as teams start to get closer and closer together, it's kind of on all of us to to be more secure. So, talk to me a little bit about I guess what you guys are doing at Sneak, and why this specific problem was something that you guys decided to attack.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it kind of also links back to literally what you just said, actually, about you know, when I was at IBM 20 years ago, just coming fresh from university, I was working on a product called WebSphere Application Server, and the release cycles of a product like that was literally every. I think the minimum was maybe a year, and it turned into like maybe 2 years, 3 years sometimes between releases, and we compare that kind of thing to what we see today in applications in more of a SaaS style environment. Uh, Developers want to constantly, and businesses want to constantly upgrade and push to production many times a day, ideally.
Yeah.
And when we think about how that then fits with traditional security, when we were releasing major releases every 2 years, it was more acceptable, maybe not as efficient, but more acceptable to have a phase called security, whereby the product is fully developed, fully tested, etc. Now we're doing some security tests on it, maybe doing some pen testing or some DAS testing or some static testing, and then at the end of that testing phase, the development team get a massive list, a big folder full of vulnerabilities that they can leaf through at their own time. And yeah, if you try and map those processes onto what we just described as a more modern process, as a DevOps process, where DevOps teams and squads, they want to be independent, they want to be autonomous. And you typically, see the 100 devs to 10 ops and one security person. Those ratios just they plain don't work
Yeah.
when we think about how to map that security testing from a security individual onto a pipeline release going
Right.
through many times a day. So that's the problem, and that's the thing that Sneak is when we were created 7 years ago. is trying to solve, that developer security, how we turn that into a developer action and how we add that into the developer workflow so that security is a part of that pipeline and a part of that test.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, again, like we were talking about a little bit backstage, I think, just like how DevOps, kind of evolved from being this, just like you're talking about, it was really more traditionally something that somebody else handled. Actually, the
Yeah.
last SaaS company that I worked at, it was really about, one person was in charge of releasing production code to all of the different servers all over the world. And, you just had to worry about getting your code checked in, and then they would
Hmm.
handle the actual release. But again, these things are starting to get a lot closer to people. And, I think that from a developer standpoint, especially, maybe you still do have SecOps people, and maybe you do still have people that are traditionally overseeing that, at least from a compliance standpoint, especially if you're an enterprise, there's probably security compliance that you have to have. But it's really starting to get to the point where it really starts with the people developing the code, right? Making sure
Mm.
that you don't have vulnerabilities in your code, making sure that that there aren't things that you are baking into the things that you're developing, the features you're developing that could be determined to be security risks in the future, right?
Hmm.
Uh, Talking a little bit about this, I think we're going to go back to the log4 shell incident and talk a little bit about that, right? So, um, from your perspective, let's talk first and foremost. For those who aren't familiar with it, let's talk a little bit about, especially from your perspective as somebody who works in security. Let's talk a little bit about what happened. What
Hmm.
was the ecosystem like back then? And why were we kind of set up to fail with this event?
Yeah, so it was almost it was kind of like a perfect storm the way it
Right.
happened, right? It happened on a Friday, close to close to the holidays in near Christmas and things like that. And yeah, I mean this was December 10th. It's amazing to think we're almost a year now since Log4Shell. Essentially, Log4Shell is a logging framework, a logging library that is heavily used across the Java ecosystem. And this is used directly by many apps, but also indirectly. So, if you rely on a specific library, that might use Log4j. Log4j. So I'm too used to saying Log4Shell now. Log4j as its logging library. So Log4Shell is referring to a vulnerability, a remote code execution vulnerability that was found in the Log4j library, and it was a 0 day. So essentially, news broke about it when people found about this, on the same day, essentially, as the day it was disclosed, and it was a first of all, it was a critical vulnerability. It was a vulnerability that was easy to exploit, and of course, all over the web, because Java is such a prevalent ecosystem. Of course, used by massive number of banks and big enterprises alike. And CVSS score was 10, which is the highest criticality for vulnerabilities, and it essentially allowed an attacker, when they put in a specific incantation of a string, when that was logged, when that string was logged, so potentially maybe a failed login attempt or something like that, the Log4j framework would actually potentially call out to using this incantation, this string. It would call out to an evil server, depending on what you sent in, pull back some code, and then execute that code locally. So it was a horrible, I mean, it's a security nightmare in terms of, the security team would look at this and think, oh my gosh, we got code that could possibly do what running on our servers.
Yeah.
Um, and the biggest problem, of course, is Log4j could be running in your environment. But a lot of the time, if the security team or the development team didn't have that visibility into your dependency graphs, could be running several layers deep in your dependency graph, you maybe not know if you are running it or not. So the first big challenge then was really to find that visibility, to understand, are we using this, where are we using it, and then how can we remediate it. And of course, like I say, this happens on a Friday night, right, or a Friday
Yep.
afternoon. yeah, not many people had a great weekend that late December week in
Yeah.
2022.
Yeah, and what you said about the dependency graph was huge because I mean, you know, I think we primarily develop with more like web technologies like JavaScript and Python,
Hmm.
but on platforms like AWS. And I remember getting emails from AWS being like, "Hey, this has been identified as a security risk on your underlying architecture." And it's really kind of, as somebody who, like, wasn't even developing in, or using that in anything like specific that we were doing, it's kind of disheartening to try and be like, oh well, what do we do to fix this,
Mm,
because the platforms that we're built on uh are vulnerable, and you're kind of powerless to do anything about it. And like you said, there's probably a lot more cases where people didn't even get notified that
mm,
this was a vulnerability in their dependencies, right? So
mm.
yeah, it ran deep, and it was concerning for a lot of people.
Absolutely. I think one of the interesting stats that we found at Sneak, 'cause of course, we can see all the dependency graphs that are being tested. One of the interesting insights that we had was two-thirds of the occurrences of log4j that existed in a dependency graph was a transitive dependency. So it wasn't even so the developers weren't directly using log4j most of the time. Most of the time, it was coming in through other dependencies, and that's a really shocking kind of stat in terms of when you want to know what's running in your estate. It's really critical to have that insight into your, well, we SBOM is a great term now that's becoming more and more popular because of things like the executive order from Biden's group and things like that, in terms of knowing your bill of material. So
Yeah.
effectively knowing where you've got something like Log4j, or whether you've got it in your environment and at what versions as well.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. So um let's talk a little bit about what are some of the things that obviously in hindsight's 2020, right? But what are some of the things that have happened since this event to help, I guess, fortify the ecosystem, but also what are some of the things that we can do as developers to kind of embrace secure development practices right from that first line of code?
Yeah, no, great question, great question. And I think actually when we see events like this, they're always, while they're an absolute headache at the time, they actually act as great catalysts in terms of change, and culture change, and for the business as well, to identify the risk and the need to be better at these kind of during these kind of incidents and events. So I think one of the things that did change, similar to Equifax or Event Stream or left pad, anything like that that occurs, it really shines a spotlight on how we are as developers and engineering groups, how we are achieving what we're trying to achieve, and whether we're doing it in the best way, the right way, the most responsible way, and so forth, as organizations. And I think one thing that really was critical was that it really shined the light on where our exposures were. And I think when a 0 day occurs, this is like, you may or may not have a critical vulnerability in your environment. This isn't,
Right.
no amount of secure development will help you identify this beforehand, because it wasn't known one day, and today it's become a known vulnerability. So now you have to
Right.
identify, where is this environment in my environment. And I think one thing it absolutely taught a lot of organizations was it's critical to be able to know in advance what we are using and where we're using it. The push with the executive order, as I mentioned, in Biden's administration, also helps that. So I think there's a lot of advances in that space. But of course, a 0 day is a very specific thing, and there are huge number of other ways in which we as organizations, we as app developers and software companies can be hacked, breached, or vulnerable. And I think we then start thinking, okay, what can we do to be, that's a great question that you asked, what can we do to be more secure in our development? And I think there are a number of things, but primarily there's a big culture shift that we need to make in our organizations. And it's not just it's not just development, and it's not just security. It's us as a group, us as an organization. We need to collaborate and collectively understand how we can introduce security into our development processes, how the developers need to take more ownership of that, more responsibility of that. We as developers need to be empowered to be able to do that. So we need, the right tooling, the right advice, the right actionable measures to become better, the right support from our organization, and a lot of that comes from the security team. And of course, just because we say let's move security more into the development workflow, that doesn't mean let's fire our security team, right? In the same
Right.
way, nothing happened to operations when
Yeah.
we moved into DevOps. It's more a change in the role. So the DevOps team then become almost like a service provider to the engineering team.
Right.
They create security services. They create the platform, the guardrails in which the development team needs to work in. They help create great programs like a security champions program, and things like that. But yeah, no, there are the number of ways in which we can dive into this if you like. There are a number of ways and good best practices in which devs can actually take steps to become better at security. And there's a long rollout process in terms of how that actually looks over time, certainly.
Yeah, I'd love to. I do want to dive into this a little bit more. I think one of the things, especially now, post pandemic, I know that there's some companies that are going back to, either in office or a hybrid work model. But I think for most of us, we're still, 100% remote. And, a good amount of us may continue to be 100% remote for a while. And, dev teams, I think at the best of times, even when we were in office, it's still very much kind of siloed, right? It's,
Mm,
it's like this is this is development, and we're like, okay, cool, we're getting ready for a release cycle. It's going to go into QA, and then from QA, it's going to move down to the operations team, and they're going to deploy it. And obviously there's some intricacies there, and if like QA finds a bug or something, but for the most part, especially us engineers being super social like we are, there's kind of this tendency for you to be in your box while you're coding. You know what I mean? Like I even tell my wife this and she kind of gets mad at me, but it's like when I'm writing code, like that's where I'm at,
mm.
because, if you take me out of that, like you have to go back and start rereading like what you're working on, and you're left like, oh, what did I do here? Anyways, but so it's very much, I think traditionally it was more siloed, right? And so you're talking about a shift in culture, right? So
Mm,
I'd love to get a little bit more granular just
mm.
on, I don't know if, you're talking about it starts with the security team, but, saying things like it's going to take a shift in culture, like those are really easy to say, but I think in practice, I think in my experience, they're things that you really have to work on, right?
Oh
Um,
yeah.
let's talk a little bit about, especially when you're talking about people that are, doing front end development or back end development who, may not have been through too many security courses, especially if they don't have a traditional CS background, maybe have gone through a boot camp or something or self taught. They might not have as much exposure to security best practices as, somebody like you who does have a CS degree. So,
Mhm.
where does this stuff kind of start? Like you said, you said it starts at the security, department, and they work as kind of a service to the other, engineering departments. But
Mhm.
let's talk through a little bit about, what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, and um, also how we can kind of like implement this, from the get-go, as we're building applications and products.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'd say there's three pillars really. There's the kind of the culture, the people is the first one. The second one is process, how we change the workflows, and then the third one is tools that allow us to support us, to be able to provide us with the an infrastructure in which we can hold ourselves accountable to the culture change, to the process change as well. I would say let's take an example like Log4Shell, right, or a third party library. A vulnerability maybe already exists in that library, and maybe we have that running in production. It's part of our backlog, or perhaps as we're developing, we're trying to introduce that third party library. So we talk about how we can kind of like change our process today so that we can avoid those kind of that kind of introduction of that. So if we think about this change, we don't want to just shift left, right? Because we can't just take security tools that was run by a security team or security individuals and then give that to developers. That just plain won't work, because those security tools are auditing tools that provide reports, or allow security teams to triage and create Jira tickets or whatever. That's not a developer tool. It's not a developer process. What
Right.
we need is a developer tool or a developer process that works in our current process, our current workflows, that will identify those types of issues. Um, when we try and change that kind of process, we don't want to overwhelm developers. So, you've seen the reports, I'm sure, just like I have, where you see tens of thousands of issues in your application. No one wants to see that, at least not a developer. So
Right.
what we need to do is become very relevant and become very actionable, and only provide information that a developer wants to see at that time. So the best thing to do is start with maybe future development. So let's say I'm writing a new feature or a new piece of code. What I would want to do is say, only show me issues that are that are introduced as part of this new piece of code. Don't worry me about all the other issues in the backlog or all the other issues that I'm not introducing, because they already exist. So you increment what the developer should be responsible for bit by bit. So let's start with maybe just the criticals in the piece of code that I'm adding. And that's how you add it to the development team piece by piece. And ultimately, the security team, they create these services, which is essentially, maybe using Sneak or something like that. So you would add Sneak in as a service. You would add it into maybe your Git repo or something like that. And you would add policies using a tool like that, to say, only alert me on these specific types of vulnerability, or these, criticality of vulnerabilities. And it starts building up that muscle, to say, okay, I'm going to start with the highest severity issues only when I create them. And then over time, as your development team get more and more familiar with that, you can then, make the bar a little bit higher and say, actually, now we're going to deal with criticals and high sevs, maybe that are fixable.
Right.
And it can continue like that. So that's, I think, the first piece, which is get the visibility across your organization first of all, and you can batch import, but don't change the workflow straight away, and then slowly increment over time. And this takes quarters or months at a time to change very slightly what a developer needs to look for, in terms of allowing them to release code with certain types of vulnerabilities, and actually saying, what, you're actually out of policy there. You need to actually work within this policy. And a lot of these policy changes, the culture side, it's really important to actually have education, have support, good documentation about the processes. And it's the security team that need to make sure they're enabling your development team to make sure they have the documentation, they know what the process is, they know who they can come to for help, if there are exceptions, or if there is more trouble than they actually first realized for this vulnerability, and they need more support or more assistance. So I think that's kind of like one of the first things that we can do.
Yeah, and I love that too, because I remember using tools like SonarQube and running a scan on on my code, and it's like, oh, there's 9 million things wrong with it, and you're like, great, where do I start? Because I got
Yeah.
to get this out by Friday, or I got to get this out for QA by Friday, and we got to release on Tuesdays. So it's like, how do I fix 9 million issues? That might be an over exaggeration. My code's not that bad, but pretty bad, right?
Yeah.
But you're like, where do I start with this? And I think a lot of times you actually start going through some of those code smells or some of the vulnerabilities, and you're realizing that, like, oh, hey, this is a false positive, but it takes time to review that stuff, right? And
Hmm.
so, like, I like what you're saying about start with new code. Like, look, especially if you're coming into an existing code base,
Right.
you as an engineer are probably less concerned about what other people have written in the past. That's probably more of a staff engineer role, or a lead role, to identify who's who wrote that and who should fix it. But you, as a new engineer on the team, you want to come in and make sure the stuff that you're writing's up to snuff, right? So
Hmm.
I really like that. The other thing, I think this is something that, at least in my personal opinion, this is probably a very unpopular opinion for people that are driving business requirements out. but there has to be enough time to iterate on a security process. You can't prioritize business needs to the point where people don't have time to sit down and understand the security policies that they're working in, and have time to fix that, right? Because if
Mm,
your priority is to push out, 6 new features every week, and that's, a yes or yes thing that needs to happen, people aren't going to have time to sit down and go, oh look, I found there's an issue here with my code, I need to go fix it, and they're like, no, you got to push it into production, right?
mm,
So I think on top of the policies, I think it's really important to make sure that from a cultural standpoint, you actually shift the priority of security uh, to the people that are writing the code, not just on this. You can't just be like, oh no, just push your code to production. We'll have the security team, run the tests and get back to you. Like there has to be enough time during the actual development process for people to, peer review or self audit, and using tools like Sneak so that they can sit down and go, oh, you know what, there's a few things I need to fix here before pushing it into production, right?
yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, by making it a part of your development process, it'll actually be quite quick to do, but it's only quick when you have a real developer tool that helps you.
Right.
And that doesn't just mean here's the issue. It means here's the issue. There's a one-click pull request that Sneak can create to fix that issue, or here's the remediation advice. You just need to upgrade to this version, etc. And it helps the developer to reach that next stage. And I think, yeah, to your point there, I'm a true believer that um, the exec team need to support this. You need
Yeah.
people in the engineering team that are willing to say, look, this is an important thing for our business. Delivering code, okay, that's great, but we need it to work well, we need it to work reliably, and we need it to be secure. And these are things that we prioritize as a business, and we'll allow you that time. There's a great program called the Security Champions Program, which is it's a formal program that a lot of organizations are adding, and it's quite a popular thing. Actually, I'm hearing more and more companies do this. And the way that I've seen them succeed best and succeed most is when it has that exec support. But sorry, let me just explain what a security champion is actually, first of
Right. Yeah.
all.
Yeah. Yeah.
A security champions program is a program where teams, development teams, DevOps teams, will have an engineer that is a security champion. And typically, every team should have a security champion. But this individual is primarily a developer. Their role is to ship code, right? Their role is to deliver functionality and deliver to the product. But a percentage of their role is to be a security champion, is to work on security aspects and hygiene, security hygiene of their team. And the exec team should have the sponsorship of this kind of a program to say, we're allowing individuals who are security champions, maybe 5%, 10%, 20% of their role, that they can dedicate to security activities during sprints. So what you'll see is, maybe security champions spending a day of a sprint or a couple of days of a sprint on security related activities. That might be educating the team. It might be working on threat modeling. It might be adding security testing and security processes into the pipeline. So there's a number of ways, or maybe working on a backlog and trying to triage that to identify working with the security team to work out which are the most critical vulnerabilities, high risk vulnerabilities that affect that team. So that ability to take a step back and actually say, we want to prioritize this and we want to dedicate time to this, it actually empowers the developers then to actually say, yes, this is important to our organization, and we will spend time on that. And it's a cultural change, and not one that happens overnight with every development organization, but is a really important step. And the thing I love about security champions programs is when you have a security champion in a development team talking with the rest of the team about security challenges or security changes, it's a dev to dev conversation, right? Because that security champion is primarily a dev in that team, but it's dev to dev, it's not security to dev. And you have a completely different conversation there when it's two developers talking about how they can
Right.
improve security versus, hey, this sec person's coming in and they want to change the way we're doing it. It's an old mentality that we have and that we need to break, but it does make a different dynamic to the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. The peer-to-peer is so much more powerful because you're like, what's
Right.
this outsider want to do with my code? Like,
Exactly, right? Yeah.
leave my code alone, dude.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. So we're out of time. I think we got through about 1.5 points that we wanted to actually talk about. But
That's how
hey,
it always happens, right? It
yeah,
always happens like that, yeah.
yeah, but I think that means it was a good conversation, and hopefully, those people listening in got some insight. Because I think there's definitely some good nuggets in there to take away. So, Simon, thanks so much for being here on the show today. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure, thank you, and
Yeah,
I really enjoyed the conversation.
yeah, me too. Before we go, Carlos, do you got we got anything else going on this week, or are we coming back next week?
No, thank you, Eddie. No, we do have one more interview that's going to happen tomorrow, right here. We're going to have it with, you can see down below that we're going to be speaking with Rachel Carpenter, the CEO of Intrenio, which is a fintech company. So keep an eye for that one right here on Tech Backstage. And Eddie, just so you know, this is our very last pre-scheduled conversation at 11 o'clock in the morning. So this is the last one remaining. No more. The rest
Got
ones,
it.
yeah, the rest ones are going to be ongoing. Everybody, remember, it's at 12. Officially, it's now at 12 p.m. Pacific time. Okay. But
Yep.
tomorrow, this one right here below is going to happen at 11 Pacific time. Keep an eye for that one. And remember, join us and be here or be square. Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos, and thanks again, Simon.